Good morning.
Good morning.
The Subcommittee on State, Foreign Operations, and Related Programs will come to order. And I welcome our distinguished colleagues. It's a pleasure to have you join us for our second hearing of the year. Even though we are still waiting for the President's fiscal year 2020 request, we have already started our appropriations season, and your voices are integral to the process. The democracy, development, diplomacy, humanitarian, and security assistance programs funded in this bill are critical to maintaining U.S. global leadership, protecting our national security, and promoting economic growth. Yet, since coming to office, the President has proposed cutting these programs by more than 30% each year. Fortunately, Congress responded with a resounding and bipartisan rejection of the administration's proposals, and it is my expectation that we will see a similarly damaging request again this year. That is why I appreciate each of you making time to testify and draw attention to these critical programs, the very programs that protect our national security and uphold our foreign policy priorities. So I thank you again for coming. I look forward to hearing from my distinguished colleagues about your priorities in the State and Foreign Operations Bill. And at this point, I would like to turn to my ranking member, Mr. Rogers, for any comments he may have.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Is it Chairwoman or Chairman?
Chair, you can choose.
Chair.
You can call me whatever you want.
Well, thank you for those opening remarks. We're glad to have several members, colleagues with us today to tell us their priorities. This hearing comes at a very important time ahead of what we expect will be another significant cut to the international affairs budget by the President, despite being rejected for 2 straight years. A lot of important programs in this bill that together make up the soft power of U.S. national security. I'm pleased we get to hear about several of them today from colleagues like yourself and others. We look forward to your testimony and yield back.
And Representative Espaillat of the 13th District of New York, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I want to thank you for joining us today. We're happy to place your full testimony into the record. Please proceed as you choose.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Rogers, for allowing me to testify during today's hearing to lay out what I feel are my priorities as they relate to the State Department and related agencies. As you know, I'm the first Dominican-American elected to serve in the U.S. Congress, and I'm also a member, obviously, of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee. And I know that, that maintaining our foreign aid and diplomatic commitments builds a strong hand for the U.S. in the Caribbean and all over the world. And the Caribbean, as you may know, is our third border. And it has its own very challenging goals and objectives and challenges that we should help them with. This is not only in the interest of helping our brothers and sisters in Central, South America, and the Caribbean, but it's also in our best interest to protect our security and improve our economic relations with these countries. I would like to begin by talking to you about Venezuela, which, as you know, has been in the news lately. It is imperative that the U.S. support the right of the Venezuelan people to freely and fairly elect their leaders, and that we support work to end the humanitarian suffering in that country. Rampant inflation, lack of access to food and medicine, and the collapse of the social services there have led to abhorrent conditions in this particular country, causing more than 3 million Venezuelans from leaving the country to neighboring countries and countries around the world. While it is of vital interest for the U.S. to provide necessary support to the Venezuelan people, we must not fall into the failed practices of the past of overstepping our bounds in the region. The U.S. cannot again be a foreign power meddling in the affairs of another country. We cannot continue to think that we are the policeman of the world. To this end, I urge the committee to continue funding programs that are vital support to the Venezuelan people. However, I urge the committee to include report language that funding be of a humanitarian nature and explicitly not intended for the use of military or state police efforts. I would also like to discuss our efforts to combat crime and illicit trafficking in the Caribbean. But before I do that, let me just say that I am in support of the Venezuelan people and their efforts to have a transparent, democratic elections and their ability to have the sovereignty to elect their own leaders. And I find that I am in support of their plight, given the horrific conditions that they find themselves into that have been pushed by the Maduro regime. I would also like, as I said, I would also like to talk about crime and illicit trafficking in the Caribbean. As I said earlier, Madam Chair, the Caribbean is the third border of our nation. Caribbean is particularly susceptible to drug trade as a midway point for narcotics produced in South America on their way to the U.S. The Caribbean Basin Security Initiative has been instrumental in providing the funding needed to combat crime and violence. Because of our efforts in Central America, and I may dare to say that many of our efforts has been successful in combating crime in that area, and we've seen even a reduction of crime in that area. The drug trade seems to be shifting more and more towards the Caribbean, and for that reason, is that I am speaking about this particular problem as the drugs begin to shift to the Caribbean and get to U.S. shores. Per the Congressional Research Services, CRS, crime and violence are on the rise in the Caribbean. CRS reports that homicide rates in the Caribbean countries has increased in recent years because of gangs and organized crime, competition between drug trafficking organizations, and the ability of firearms. A recent report from the Government Accountability Office indicates program-by-program successes within the CBSI, but also a need for improved data collection. In accordance with this report, I plan to introduce legislation to both develop better data reporting mechanism and to authorize increased funds to expand this crucial initiative. We know how last year the President proposed dramatic cuts in this particular area. Well, I'm asking for this funding for the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative to be doubled this year, and I will be submitting legislation so that we can accomplish that. I urge this committee again to double the funding for the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative for fiscal year 19. And I will continue to work with you, Madam Chair, to ensure that we do the best work that we can to ensure that the third border of our country, the United States of America, is protected and that we reap the benefits of our efforts there. I thank you for hearing my concerns and priorities, and I have submitted additional testimony in writing to the committee, which I hope you would also take into consideration. Thank you so much.
Well, I thank you for appearing before us and certainly emphasizing a very, very key priority. They are our neighbors, and our response is so important. Mr. Rogers, do you have any question?
Thank you, Chair. Venezuela, you urge that we include funding of a humanitarian nature. We've got that type of aid stacked up at the border, and they won't let it in. How do you propose that we overcome this obstacle? Because if we provide more funding and more humanitarian aid and it can't get in, why do it?
I recognize that that's tragic, that a lot of the funding that's going to help the Venezuelan people is being stopped at some of their border points. My proposal is that we work with the international community and organizations such as the United Nations and the Organization of American States, the OAS, as well as non-for-profits and organizations that have had a long tradition of providing humanitarian aid across the world to ensure that the partisan political sort of like aspect of this is sort of like pushed aside, and we get the help to the Venezuelan people as quickly as possible. I think the goal, as you, I'm sure, agree with me, is to ensure that the people of Venezuela get that humanitarian aid as quickly as possible. And so by working with other international organizations, bodies, and other governments that may themselves be getting that humanitarian aid in, I think that we can accomplish that goal.
Central America, South America, and turmoil. I don't recollect a time when we've seen more bad things going on. All the way from Venezuela, even the drug increase from Colombia, then the Central American Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, furnishing tons of refugees as well as drugs and criminals and the like. What do we do? What are we doing wrong in Central South America?
I think that we have turned our heads, our backs on that region for far too long. And they're really our backyard. We should have an ongoing positive working relationship. We have abdicated our leadership role in that region and created a vacuum of leadership. For that reason, we see now recently how countries even like China have stepped in to plug that leadership gap that we've left unattended for far too long. I think that we need to go back into the region and play a leadership role. But you cannot do that empty-handed. You have to be able to come to the table with resources, and saying that we need to be a leader in the region and then saying we're going to cut the budget by half is not the way to go. We must establish our leadership again, but we must do it by assisting those nations to address some of the fundamental reasons why there is a large migration, an exodus of families for the most part. And I've been down at the border and seen firsthand, at least at the detention centers where I went, that at least 80% of the people there crossing the border were women with small children. And so we have to find out why it is that women are fleeing these nations. Is it gang violence? Is it gangs that are trying to recruit their young sons? Is it a natural disasters, as it's happened in some countries? Is it abject poverty and famine? And then we have to address the root causes of these problems so that we can nip or impact positively the migration patterns of the region. But we cannot do that by coming empty-handed. We need to, again, reassert ourselves as the leader of the Americas and do so by assisting governments to provide good services and programs that will reduce the migration.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ranking Member.
Thank you, and I just want to say, we have provided almost $3.5 billion over 4 years for Honduras, El Salvador.
That's correct.
And Guatemala. And it seems to me, having worked with Vice President Biden a few years ago on a program in the same area, we really have to focus hard and just understand where the money is going, why it isn't used more effectively.
That's correct.
The whole strategy of keeping people home. What was that called again, his Biden program? The Northern
Triangle.
Triangle program, right. I remember working, a group of us worked closely with him on it, and we just can't give up.
I agree, Madam Chair.
We keep working on it.
I agree, and just keep in mind that as we begin to pay more attention to the border in Central and South America, drug dealers will shift their strategy to other borders, and I testified today that we predict that will be the Caribbean, which has some inherent weaknesses in the region that would allow for drug dealers to transport their drugs and then send them to the United States. And of course, we've seen dramatic repercussions in those countries, high homicide rates now, violence in urban settings in the cities of those countries. And we must shift our attentions to that part of the region. And that's why I'm proposing a doubling of the Caribbean Basic Security Initiative program.
Well, I want to thank you, and I look forward to your continued wisdom and advice because we can't afford to fail. And I thank you very much for bringing this once more front and center to our attention.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I just hope to be just like you one day when I grow up.
Oh, my goodness.
Take care.
Thank you. I hope I can continue to be as wise as you are with as much knowledge.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Where is he? Oh, coming in the back door. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel.
Mrs. Lower, you've been holding out on me. I didn't know you had such wonderful digs here.
Oh, my
I feel
goodness.
very jealous.
Oh, no, no. Well, actually, this digs goes back and forth. My good friend, Mr. Rogers, had
I
it,
have.
and we've been hanging out here for a while.
This view is just magnificent.
It is. We'll come more often, come
Yeah, I
visit.
will. I gotta hide from the press, you know?
Well, let me just say I'm delighted to welcome Representative Engel of the 16th District of New York. Our districts keep changing. He's a dear friend, he's a neighbor, and he is the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And we really thank you for testifying before this subcommittee. And of course, proceed as you will. We're happy to include your whole testimony into the record.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Engel.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Rogers, members of the subcommittee, and I'm very happy to thank members of the subcommittee. I'm glad to be back in front of this distinguished panel to reiterate a key point, which is one of the most important things we can do to advance America's security, interests, and values around the world is to provide robust funding for our international affairs budget. This is an area which Congress can and should assert its role as a co-equal branch of government, and regrettably, there's a lot about the Trump administration's foreign policy that Congress cannot do a lot about. It's painful. We just came back from Munich and also Brussels to talk to our allies, and I can't begin to tell you how confused our allies are. They're used to America leading, and they're not used to America denigrating our alliances, which have been the core of our policy, certainly since World War II. And we pointed out to our friends that there were probably about 50 members of Congress in Munich, and that that's about a large percent of the Congress, and that we all feel strongly about the fact that we need to stay in our alliances, lead in our alliances, and do the kinds of things that people expect America to do. So it's frankly very painful when the president denigrates our allies and cozies up to dictators. We should not walk away from international obligations and abandon the values that should be the core of our policy. I believe it weakens us, it's isolated us, and it's made Americans less safe. So in my view, one of the most problematic aspects of the president's foreign policy is the way it's shelved American diplomacy. Senior State Department officials have been chased to the exits. Morale in the State Department, I can tell you, has plummeted. Expertise has gone ignored. And with the first two budget requests, the administration showed us that they still don't get it. They won't understand the value of diplomacy and development. They don't understand that America needs these foreign policy tools to diffuse crises and stop wars before they start, that by prioritizing these efforts, we avoid sending our men and women in uniform into harm's way somewhere down the line. What was particularly galling to me was the first proposal came out of the administration when the administration was new, cutting the State Department 31%, at the same time putting increases in defense. I have no I don't oppose certain increases in defense, but not at the expense of diplomacy. And why would we want to have a 31% cut to the State Department? Diplomacy helps keep us out of wars. And it has just been that kind of attitude. Thankfully, we beat back the 31%. Democrats and Republicans came together to beat it back. And we had most of the money restored, and then the following year, when the administration had to propose the new budget, they went right back to the old 31% decrease, which to me is a slap in the face to the Congress and what we're supposed to do. And so I keep hearing that the morale is terrible, that the expert people that have been around for so many years are leaving in droves, that the people feel they're being targeted because of ethnic or political pressures. And it's just a very bad thing when you have so many ambassadors not even in place, when you have so many people in high positions not even in place, and when you have people perceive that they're being targeted for the way they look or for their political persuasion. That's not the way it should happen. So one of the things we can do together as Republicans and Democrats in Congress is to turn back attempts by the administration to hollow out American diplomacy and development. And as I mentioned, we've done so twice before in a bipartisan manner. Excuse me. And I imagine the administration's budget that will come to us next week will call for similar to draconian cuts that we saw in the previous 2 years that I mentioned. Excuse me. My request to this committee is that we carry on the strong bipartisan tradition of making sure our foreign affairs agencies and personnel have the support and investments they need to carry out their critical work. Our constitutional power of the purse is a critical way we can effectively reverse the unwise course the administration seeks for American diplomacy. My commitment as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee is that I'll work with colleagues on both sides of the aisle to bolster the State Department and USAID, and will use our oversight authority to make sure Congress's will is being followed. Last year, President Trump sought to pull back huge sums of State Department and USAID's funding and to redirect funding from the State Department to the Department of Homeland Security. That's a slap in the face to the constitutional authority of this committee and this Congress, and we should not stand for it. I want to make sure the investments this committee makes in our foreign policy are being put to use to make our country stronger and safer, and I want to make sure we take whatever legislative steps are necessary to make our State Department, USAID, and other foreign affairs agencies modern, efficient, and effective. That's why one of my top priorities is to pass a State Department Authorization Act. The last time Congress sent such a bill to the President's desk was way back in 2002. We owe more to the men and women working on the front lines of diplomacy and development. We need to have their backs, especially when the administration lets them down. So I look forward to working hand in hand with my Appropriations Committee colleagues to promote American leadership around the world with a strong, well-resourced, bipartisan foreign policy. Thank you, and I yield back.
Well, thank you very much to my good friend and classmate. I find it encouraging, frankly, that 50 people went to the Munich Security Conference. In fact, I think it was maybe 5 years ago, I forget, the great Senator John McCain asked me to go with him, and there were 5 of us that went to the conference, and I know how important it is and effective, and I'm sure your voice and your ideas were well received. So I thank you for your leadership and all the good work you're doing.
Thank you. I want to just say that we pointed out that 50 is one-tenth of the Congress was over in Munich.
Were they all actively involved
Yeah.
with speaking roles, et cetera?
Well, even just in questioning roles. I mean, a lot of it wasn't speaking, but there were panels that people attended to listen to that were very well attended. It was very, very good.
It's just, I
It was
found
the
it to
largest
be,
showing ever.
yeah, I found it to be extraordinary. So from 5 of us to 50 is impressive that, number one, there is all this strong interest in foreign affairs. So I thank you for representing us. Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for coming by. With your newfound gavel, congratulations, by the way,
Thank you.
comes the responsibility to pass an authorization bill. As you say in your testimony, we've not had such an animal since 2002. And much of the work has been done by this subcommittee because of that fact. We don't want to do that. We want the authorization committee to address the difficulties that you've outlined in your remarks. And we'll play second fiddle. But we are tired of playing lead fiddle. We're not equipped for it. We don't have the staff or the coverage. So please, take these issues up and pass out of your committee an authorization bill. And we'll be the first ones to vote for it.
I thank you. I couldn't agree with you more. It's been a source of frustration for me ever since I got to Congress. As the chairwoman has pointed out, she and I came to Congress together, so we've been here a long time, and it's been a long time that we haven't done this, and there's no reason for it. There's no responsible reason for it. So I thank you and look forward to working with you and the chairwoman.
Thank you. Tally ho.
Thank you.
And with your excellent leadership, I am cautiously optimistic you will pass an authorization act this year. So thank you very much. I really look forward to continuing our work together. I know we have so many of the same priorities, and you have been an outstanding chair, and for me, it's a pleasure being your partner.
Well, it is. I think we've always in the 30 years had districts that were abutting each other, joining each other, and I think that you've probably represented at least half the people in my district, and I've probably represented at least half the people in your district from time
Correct.
to time. So it's
Correct.
certainly been a pleasure working with you, and the outstanding job you're doing as chair and ranking member who is chair for so many years as well. It's, this is to watch this is the way we wish Congress would work all the time. So I thank you both.
Thank you very much. We look forward to continuing to share our information and working together.
Thank you, Madam
Thank you.
Chair.
Okay, and now I am delighted to welcome Representative Mcgovern of the 2nd District of Massachusetts, the chairman of the Rules Committee. It's great to see you.
Well, it's great to be here,
I'm
and it's great to
happy
hear
to-
Elliot say we're going to pass the State Department authorization bill. That's going to be so much fun in rules. I want to hold my breath. Yeah.
I'm here to have fun.
Well, we are very pleased that you're chair of the committee who sets the rules. And for me, it's been a pleasure knowing you, working with you ever since your kids were,
Yeah.
geez, it's quite amazing. We've been here a few years, so thank you for appearing before us. We're happy to place your testimony in the record. Proceed as you will.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Lowy and Ranking Member Rogers. Thank you for welcoming me here, and thank you for all the incredible work that you do on the Appropriations Committee. You have my great admiration. And let me also begin by thanking you for the FY 2019 increase for the nutrition sub-account within the Global Health Programs account. The $20 million increase to $145 million after 4 years of flat funding is very welcome. This increased funding in nutrition enables USAID to target nutrition interventions during pregnancy and the early critical stages of childhood, where better nutrition has the greatest impact on the child's development and brain growth. For FY 2020, I respectfully ask the committee to increase funding again for the nutrition sub-account to $195 million, including an additional $20 million for interventions to address maternal and pediatric anemia, and $30 million to expand breastfeeding initiatives. And, you know, I've worked a lot on hunger issues and food insecurity issues and nutrition issues domestically and internationally. And with regard to our international programs, I think that they are not only the right thing to do morally, but they enhance our security. People are grateful for our support in these areas. And I want to now turn to Colombia, if I can. There's a great deal of talk about drugs and the crisis in Venezuela, but I ask the committee to please maintain its focus on Colombia proper, especially support for fully implementing the peace accords that ended 60 years of armed conflict. The accords hold great promise for economic growth, stability, and social progress, but currently they are in danger of being undermined or abandoned. And this would be bad for Colombia, and this would be bad for U.S. national security. So I respectfully ask the committee to maintain or increase funding for Colombia. Emphasis should remain on implementation of the peace accords, Afro-Colombian, indigenous, and rural community-based development, and aid that promotes human rights, good governance, strong and independent judicial institutions, and breaking the culture of impunity that protects state, military, and criminal actors from investigation and prosecution. In particular, the three mechanisms created by the peace accords that focus on the right of victims require greater funding and support, namely the Truth Commission, the Search for the Disappeared, and the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. Madam Chair, I'm deeply concerned about the fate of the peace accords and human rights in Colombia. Right now, the Colombian Congress is debating President Duque's 4-year National Development Plan. As written, the NDP is likely to undo many agreements reached on rural and agrarian development in the accords. If approved, it might well doom Colombia to ever-escalating violence in rural areas where the conflict has always been the most intense, sustained, and brutal, ensuring that these regions remain ungoverned spaces at the mercy of violent criminal actors. The NDP also includes provisions to unravel progress made in labor rights, creating substandard wages and benefits for workers, especially in the agricultural sector. So these standards, by the way, are even lower than those in place when the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement was signed, which I might add is a violation of the terms of the FTA itself, not to mention Colombia's obligations under the Labor Action Plan. So I think it's important that the committee signal emphatically that such actions place in legal jeopardy all forms of U.S. aid and trade. It is also critical that the committee act on the continuing escalation of murders and assaults against human rights defenders and local social leaders. As you know, I also co-chair the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in Colombia, and currently Colombia is the deadliest place in the world for rights defenders. At least one social leader has been murdered every 2 days on average since the peace agreement was signed at the end of 2016. Over 60 social leaders have been assassinated since President Duque assumed office. And I know President Duque was up here, met with a lot of members of Congress. I attended one of those meetings. He talks the talk, but we need to make sure he walks the walk. And while his government points to action plans and high-level strategy meetings on the crisis, it has been very, very, very slow to act. And clearly, whatever plans they have devised, they are not working. So there's an urgent need for protection and to identify and hold to account those who carry out and benefit from these acts of violence. The committee must ensure that there are consequences for such a stunning lack of urgency on the part of the Colombian state to protect and defend human rights and social leaders. And so I urge the committee to take a hard line with the State Department on what determines effective steps to reduce attacks against human rights defenders in the conditions tied to 20% of the FMF funds for Colombia. Now, while I would have liked to talk about several issues related to Central America, I will instead submit them as expanded testimony for the record. And let me just say that it is important to recognize that each country is unique with its own set of challenges, many of which contribute to high levels of violence, deprivation, and lack of hope in the future that drive so many thousands to flee their homes and seek security elsewhere, including here in the United States. And no wall and no barrier and no new restrictions in our asylum laws will prevent families from fleeing until the root causes in each country are addressed, including corruption and impunity. And this requires long-term commitment and investments on our part. So please let me thank you once again for giving me this opportunity to talk about these priorities, and I certainly welcome any questions that you might have.
I just want to thank you for your thoughtful testament. For those of us who've been to Colombia several times and worked with several leaderships that have been there, this is the most difficult time to deal with because certainly we all thought there was progress, we were moving in place, and you recount to us the tremendous challenges that remain. And I personally would like to work more closely with you to see what we can do. Every time you think you've made progress, we hit a period like this where the crime is extraordinary.
No, and I appreciate that. And look, I mean, Colombia can be a model for the rest of the world on how you end violent conflicts.
And we thought it was right
Yeah,
after that.
Right, and that is why we need to make sure these peace accords are implemented. And I understand all the attention on Venezuela, but we can't let that take away from the fact that there are things in Colombia that are failing right now. You know, I want Colombia to succeed, and I think we need to put pressure on this new government to, in the area of making sure that they adhere to the peace accords.
Thank you very much, and I'll look forward to working with you. Mr. Rogers.
Well, thank you, Jim, for being here today. Important testimony. I'm so sick of having to try to get Colombia to do what they've said they want to do for years.
Where's Yoga?
Through one leader after another, we hear the same promises and the same predictions, all to no avail. Part of the problem now is the overflow of refugees from Venezuela,
Right.
along with others. But the enduring problem for us, from our interest as a country, is the drug
Right.
production, which has been for forever the treasure trove of coca, and the addiction of some 47,500 people who've overdosed. It's a horrendous problem that gets scant attention, and it has its basis in Colombia. And we provided funds, leadership, training, personnel, you name it. And I've been there as well, and been in the fields and cut some stuff down myself. My district and my state has been ground zero for overdose exposure. And so I have a personal interest in seeing that we try to get a stop on that problem. The peace accords, of course, dealt with whether or not you can aerial spray the coca production, which I think is about the only way you can handle it. The crop is so huge. They're relying upon hand, individual cutting of the bush. This new president comes out promising again, and he'll be up here soon, and we'll have him before this subcommittee, and we'll hear the same promises we've had for a long time.
Well, I think when he comes up here, we can't be a cheap date, and we need to make sure that he keeps his promises. But let me just say this. This is why implementing the peace accords are so important, because part of the peace accords, you know, deal with helping develop some of the rural areas, you know, where a lot of the coca is grown. Crop substitution is one of the promises as well, trying to help people who, poor farmers who've been growing this illicit crop, who get nothing really for doing so, but it's the only way they can make a living, to help them transition into legal crops. When I was last there, I went out to some of these rural areas, and people are telling me that nobody from the government is coming out to provide alternatives. And that there are new actors coming into some of these rural, ungoverned areas, you know, once again, getting involved in these illegal crops. I personally don't believe in aerial fumigation for a whole bunch of reasons. I think environmentally it's bad. I think from a health perspective it's bad. I think the I think the most effective way to do it, quite frankly, is to implement the peace accords and transition people out into growing legal crops, and you know, and having the government have a presence in places where they haven't had a presence, and enforcing the law, and arresting people who are doing these things, and because otherwise it's the same old, and I have a lot of constituents too who have you know, been victims of this of all these drugs coming into our country. But I'm convinced that the way forward is implementing these peace accords, and that's why when President Duque was here, I was a little bit, well, more than a little bit concerned that you know, he didn't seem as committed to the implementation of these accords. And he said things that I think the administration wanted to hear on Venezuela, but you know, putting Venezuela aside, he needs to do his job in Colombia. And I think a strong message from this committee that we're watching and that we're not happy with any attempts to withdraw from the implementation of the peace accords, I think would be very, very welcome.
I think we had such a warning in the bill that we just passed, where we, among other things, where we say to Colombia, no longer are we going to withhold funds based upon your promise of reduction of coca production. From here on out, you actually have to show us facts and figures showing fewer tonnage than before, or else you don't get the money.
So, again, I think implementation of the peace accords would be helpful. And the other thing, as I said, I co-chair the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. The level of attacks and murders of rights defenders is astonishingly high. It is getting worse. It is at a crisis level. When social leaders are murdered or human rights defenders are murdered, there's a consequence that is chilling and moves the country backwards. If Colombia wants to develop, it can't be known as one of the most violent places in the world. And from a rights perspective, this is like one of the worst countries in the world. Anyway, I appreciate you listening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Someone bring me.
You want me? Oh, my goodness, in the hot seat.
Well,
Howdy, how you doing? Good to see you again.
pleasure to see you.
Hey, Ted.
Mr. Chairman, see you.
It is a pleasure, sir, to welcome Representative Yoho of the 3rd District of Florida,
Thank you.
a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. It's good to see you again, and we'd be happy to place your full testimony in the record. Please proceed as you will. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to be here again. It was 2 years ago when I was here before, and I appreciate it. Chairman Lowy, Ranking Members Rogers, members of the committee, thank you for convening this hearing to discuss the critical resources needed to protect our nation, advance our values, and uphold America's leadership role in the world. With our leadership and guidance, this committee has the important task of determining what resources are required to meet our immense responsibilities. As the committee begins to consider the FY20 request, I would like to update you on an exciting new development, the establishment of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, DFC for short. Last year, along with Rep. Adam Smith, I introduced the Better Utilization of Investment Leading to Development, easily said the BUILD Act, to consolidate, bolster, and modernize the U.S. government's development finance tools. I'm excited to share with this committee that this bipartisan proposal, with the help of many of you, became law last October. And this is an incredible achievement we can all be proud of. Showed bipartisanship, bicameralship, and got signed into law in short order. Development finance refers to the use of loans, guarantees, insurance, and other financial tools to projects that will have development impact. For instance, many of us have seen the power projects in Africa that have been financed through either OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, or USAID's Developed Credit Authority. Unlike traditional grants, these are investments which pay back over time. In fact, it was built with OPIC's model in mind, which has returned money to the U.S. Treasury 40 out of 41 years at no cost to the taxpayers. In 2016, OPIC was authorized at $69 million. It returned $265 million. So we built upon that. Under the BUILD Act, OPIC and DCA will cease to exist at the end of this fiscal year and instead be housed together under the Development Finance Corporation starting in fiscal year 20. But it's not just the consolidation that is achieved. The BUILD Act brings increased flexibility so that the U.S. government can better use development finance to take on the world's greatest development challenges and place the DFC more prominently in the U.S. strategy for developing worlds. The other key element of the BUILD Act was to modernize the tools available to the U.S. government. In this respect, a tool possessed by all other development finance institutions except the U.S. is equity authority. The BUILD Act provides this critical authority which provides not just a key development tool, but will also allow the United States to be economically interoperable with allies such as Germany, Japan, and the UK. For all its strength, OPEC has a difficult working in partnerships and the leveraging the investment of our allies because of its lack of equity authority. So many times OPEC, it was an outdated model and it did good, but it wasn't at the table. In fact, we found out it wasn't invited to the table because it was outdated. While the BUILD Act envisions that the DFC's total equity investments could approach 35% of its overall portfolio, it is important to note that like the DFC loans that will be paid back over time, equity has a similar potential for repayment. I look forward to working with the committee on this important new aspect of the DFC to ensure that it is resourced and structured for long-term success. Madam Chair, this committee's support is incredibly important at this critical time. As the top Republican on the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee on Nonproliferation, I've been through the region, I've been through Africa and our own hemisphere, and seen the challenges. Like you have, everywhere we go, we see China loading up developing countries with debt they won't be able to repay, bring in Chinese workers versus using domestic workers, and not respecting the environment. With the establishment of the DFC, we have a viable alternative that countries can call upon, where they can bring in private sector financing, employ their own people, and do things in a transparent way. This model of development of bringing in private capital is becoming more prominent as the needs just can't be met with government-alone resources. The newly created DFC will be an important tool against an ever-aggressive China. China's Belt and Road Initiative has undermined American security and prosperity around the world. China is aggressively attempting to expand its influences not only through the world, throughout Asia, but around the world, especially in Africa, through its Belt and Road Initiative, which is nothing more than predatory loans, a predatory loan scheme that indentures nations to China. For instance, this happened in Sri Lanka, which had to hand over a deep water port and over 15,000 acres of China for the next 99 years in a lease. Pakistan has added billions to its debt through its partnership with China in building a port in Gwadar. In fact, they're looking for a bailout for that from the IMF. The list of countries being hammered or harmed by China's BR initiative continues to grow, and it's imperative for global and American security that U.S. DFC is sufficiently funded. Lastly, I'll note for the committee that OPEC and DCA will cease to exist at the end of this fiscal year. Should fiscal year foreign operations bill not be signed into law, and this is an extremely important area, if it's not signed into law by the start of the fiscal year, I'll want to work with this committee on anomaly language to ensure DFC can be established on October 1st. There is no time to waste. Thank you for your leadership, for the bipartisan atmosphere and respect and problem solving that you've instilled in this committee. You have the ability to shape America's future as a global leader by investing in diplomacy and development, and I look forward to working with you. This BUILD Act is something that is sorely needed as a diplomatic tool around the world through our embassies, the State Department. I just left a meeting with Susan Rice this morning, Ambassador Rice, and she was talking about the BUILD Act, how imperative and how timely it is to offset what China is doing with their Belt Road Initiative. This is a tool that, like I said, it's bipartisan. The administration signed it into law, and it's something that'll last beyond this Congress because of the strong bipartisanship of it. And so I look forward to your consideration of support.
Well, I thank you very much, and I look forward to working with you. What I have found in my travels, when China is building, they're bringing their own workers. So they really are not encouraging economic development and creating jobs.
You're
They
so right.
bring their workers, and the benefits are to them. So I look forward to working with you, and I thank you for appearing today.
Thank you, ma'am.
Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho, for your support for this program. Is the motivation China here, is that the big push that we're having to deal with?
No, that wasn't the original impetus behind this. The original impetus was, as you know, I came in to get rid of foreign aid, and we talked about that last time. The thing we really want is we can't get rid of foreign aid, but we can help countries wean from aid and move them to trade as quick as we can. Because if we move to trade, We're developing infrastructures, we're developing economies. If we develop economies, there's a better lifestyle. You're bringing people out of poverty. So it deconflicts the rest of the world, and this is an important thing. The Belt Road Initiative was something that showed up in China. The estimates have invested over $4 trillion. And really what they're doing is they're buying up seaports, strategic seaports around the world that we're gonna have to deal with someday. So this was a way to offset this. And we've had both Republicans and Democrats, people in leadership roles, past secretaries of state and current, that have said that this is the biggest way to compete to offset what China is doing. I don't want to say compete because I think we're all for favorable competition, but not at the expense of another country.
Well, everywhere we go, as the chairman has said, and you've said, every country that I've been in of recent vintage, China is there.
Right.
Giving money, making loans that have no way to be repaid, enslaving countries like Sri Lanka.
Sure.
And others. All for the purpose of enhancing the Chinese economy.
It's all for China.
And we've been caught, I think, with our hands down. And the more we can build up this build organization to combat this scourge of Chinese enslavery, better off we are.
I agree, and I appreciate those comments. This is something that they're looking to roll out October of this year. They're going through the rulemaking process, and we just asked for considerable attention to the financing of this so that it can be implemented. We're working with the Department of State, with the ambassadors. What's the name of that corporation, Jimmy, or that organization where they educate the ambassadors? We're working with that so that the people in our embassies understand what the BUILD Act can do. And there's an educational process, and I think it's a $5 million funding that will help them implement this so that we can go out and we can start implementing this so that our foreign allies or the countries we're going into can say, well, wait a minute, this is different than what China's offering. It's different from OPEC because OPEC was so outdated. Like I said, they wouldn't even get invited to the table. We couldn't partner up with JPEC out of Japan or DFID out of the UK. And so now we can partner up with other countries' development finance corporations and do massive infrastructure projects. In addition, we can take an equity stake, and so instead of giving money out, we get no return, we can invest and get a return. It'd be like say a toll road, you know, so we are getting a benefit, but we're gonna use domestic help in those countries, unlike China and Cambodia that came in there, built a casino, built their own restaurants, built their own hotels, brought their own material and their own people, and didn't help the underlying economy of Cambodia. And this is something I think we can do better, and it's up, you know, all of us to make sure these things get rolled out properly, and I appreciate your consideration.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Torres, do you have any
Hey,
questions?
how you doing?
I want to say congratulations on
Thank you.
your work on this BUILD Act.
It was a group effort, and I thank all of you for your support.
Thank you. As we marked it up last year in Foreign Affairs Committee, thank you for accepting my amendment to ensure that, you know, we looked at that transparency and public corruption part of it. I have to agree with you in traveling to South America. Ecuador, for example, we were just there last November. Sometime ago.
Hey, Martha, how you?
It was just last year, yes. There is great need for them to refinance the debt that they have with China. And we see that all across the Americas. It is unfortunate that,
Throughout South America.
right, right. It is so unfortunate that they have put themselves in such a situation, a dire situation, where they don't see a way out of the China umbrella. So if this can help in any way.
Oh, we're excited about this. We really are.
Refinancing some of these debts, I think, could really help.
That's
So
great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Ms. Roby?
Good, thank you.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am. Y'all take care.
For appearing before us. Welcome, welcome.
Aloha.
Aloha. With this weather, I wish we were all in Hawaii today.
It looks like it's 75 out there, but it's not, so.
Well, I want to thank you, Representative Case of Hawaii, a new member of the Appropriations Committee. I appreciate your coming before us and testifying today, and please proceed as you wish. You can either read your full testimony, talk your way through it, place your full testimony in the record, as you choose.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Ranking Member, members. Thank you for allowing me to spend a little bit of time with you this morning. You do have my written testimony. I'm going to try to summarize it. My purpose in coming before you today is to highlight the critical importance of our efforts in all spheres across the Indo-Pacific region. Since the end of the Second World War, the U.S. has helped to build a free and open order in the Indo-Pacific region that has guaranteed security, enhanced trade and development, and promoted human rights. And this rules-based order has created conditions that prevented large-scale war and encouraged economic growth and democratic development, allowing the region to become one of the fastest-growing in the world. Among the success stories, ironically, of this regional order is China, a country that in just a generation has lifted countless millions, hundreds of millions out of poverty and grown into one of the world's largest economies. But we now have a choice to make with China, where China will be deciding, and we will be deciding whether China will continue to be part of this rules-based order, whether it will continue with a path of growth and interaction and peace, or whether it will reject the rules-based liberal democratic order and export authoritarianism, reject human rights, and advance its own interests to the exclusion of others. So as I sit here with you in terms of how we should expend our valuable funds in the area of the Department of State and related foreign affairs, I will say that I believe that it is critical for us to get it right with respect to the Indo-Pacific region and China specifically. And I think that the answer is the fullest possible engagement. So I do not agree with those that believe that the solution to the Indo-Pacific region and China and the rest of the world is to disengage. I believe that the answer is the fullest possible engagement, not only with China, but with our allies and partners, folks out there that have stood by us for generations since the Second World War, and folks that we want to stand with us today as we go down the road. This has been a nonpartisan, bipartisan effort over at least the past 2 presidencies and multiple Congresses who have committed us to the same basic strategy in the Indo-Pacific to strengthen our alliances and partnerships, increase our military presence, and you certainly will in this committee, the broader committee, evaluate the military defense budget in that context, but also to promote trade, development, and the rule of law, the projection of soft power, as some people talk about it. Congress affirmed this strategy last year through the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, and I urge this committee, number one, to appropriate the necessary funding to carry out that act and support related programs that contribute to our strategy in the Indo-Pacific. I say this all because I believe it's in the interest of our country, but also because, as a representative from Hawaii, I know that we have an incredibly important role to play in the Indo-Pacific. Not only do we have in Hawaii the headquarters of Indo-Pacom, the largest and I believe most important, if I can say it that way, unified command that we have in our world today, stretching all the way from the west coast of California to the west coast of India, the entire Pacific and half the Indian Oceans. But we also truly lie at the intersection of east and west in Hawaii, and have for generations now. We have for generations now hosted foreign visitors, business people, students, and professionals. And there's a great mixing in Hawaii that often goes unrecognized in the rest of the country on all levels, whether it be defense, whether it be economic, whether it be social, whether it be educational, whether it be professional, scientific, whether it just be visitors in a restaurant in Waikiki talking to each other about their respective countries. We have a role to play in this, and we have programs in Hawaii that have been funded to that effect in Hawaii. The one that I want to focus on today is the East-West Center. The East-West Center was started in 1960, and it was started for this specific purpose, to facilitate and foster engagement on several levels between East and West. We saw after the war that we needed to start to reach out to the Asia-Pacific region in a systematic way. The East-West Center, which is affiliated with the University of Hawaii, not part of the University of Hawaii, and those of you that have been there know that it's a beautiful facility that works very, very hard to have the top scholars in the world host an atmosphere in which folks can come together to provide mutual education, foster better relationships and understanding. Programs include education, research, and professional development for students, scholars, and officials from across the Indo-Pacific region. In 2018 alone, the center had over 3,400 participants from 41 countries in its programs, hosted 24 public events here in its Washington, D.C. offices. And I think that most importantly, if you look through the generations, the East West Center now has 65,000 alumni. They're spread out all throughout the Indo-Pacific region. So you have leaders of India and Pakistan and China and Japan and the compact countries of the South Pacific and Australia, who have all come together at one time or another at the East West Center, and they have their own network. I think that's incredibly valuable, incredibly critical to us as we go through this next generation where we are going to have stresses and strains in the Indo-Pacific region that we have simply not seen before. So I'm here to advocate for full funding for the East West Center. The East West Center in the last number of years has sometimes wondered whether it was going to survive from one year to the other. It has not been in some presidents' budgets. It has been on the chopping block here on occasion. And, you know, I just frankly think that after 2 generations of success, 2 generations in which it has developed and demonstrated its worth, that it deserves at this point, especially considering the importance of the Indo-Pacific region, the contributions that the East-West Center has played and can play, that we recognize it for what it is and provide a more stable level of funding over the next generation. So I would support full funding of its request at $20.1 million for the upcoming fiscal year. Beyond that, I certainly would support other key efforts that are critical to the Indo-Pacific region. For example, the FMF and IMET programs operated by state in conjunction with DoD have been really, really valuable, I think, to the Indo-Pacific region, and would certainly urge that those be funded. Similarly with the Economic Support Fund and the Development Assistance accounts. Sometimes it is difficult to calculate the impact of more indirect spending out in the rest of the world, including the Indo-Pacific. But I believe that at this point we can conclude that this is incredibly valuable spending for us, and I would certainly advocate that this subcommittee focus on the Indo-Pacific region as you consider your important work. Thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions.
Well, I thank you very much for your testimony. It's always a pleasure to see you. And I know you're a strong advocate of the center, and I look forward to continuing to learn more about it. And I don't know that I have a question for you today.
Thank you.
So I'll
Thank you,
turn
Chair.
to Mr. Rogers. Thank you.
Well, you're right about East-West Center. It's been on and off here in this subcommittee, even, and the full committee, and the full Congress, for a variety of reasons. Some think we, in the East, need more than soft power. However, given the emergence of China as a global competitor of ours now for business and trade, it's important that we bolster the East-West ties as strong as we can. I remember going to Bali 25 years ago or so, and we met with what was referred to as the Prince of Bali. He would have been the king of the province of Bali had they not integrated into Indochina, Indonesia. We had a great long visit with this elder statesman who was revered, one of the founding fathers of SEATO. But the thing that motivated this elderly statesman, Balinese, was his fear of China. He anticipated, thought that China was out to bring back under the Chinese umbrella all peoples who originated with a Chinese dialect. That fear is prevalent now, as you know, still stronger. And I'm not sure that the East-West Center is doing enough to spread that idea, and more importantly, to counteract it. What do you think?
Well, I think it's an excellent question, and I think it does get to the mission of the East-West Center, because my own belief is that with China, and you could say the same thing of Russia or any other adversaries or potential adversaries around the world, the best possible approach in the big picture is first and foremost a strong defense, so that you don't encourage anybody to think you will be taken advantage of, but also engagement on all levels. So as you can engage from the international trade perspective, you strengthen those ties. As you can engage from the educational and social and financial and business aspect, you strengthen those ties. That's the best. I think that's the best way to deal with China. I have absolutely no hesitation to say that I think Indo-Pacom should be fully funded. I think that it needs what it needs to get the job done in the Indo-Pacific region. But that's not the only way to handle China. And I think if we go down simply a pure defense approach, then we will be making a mistake with China in the long run. I think that where the East-West Center fits into it, if I understand your comments correctly, you are perhaps concerned that the East-West Center is not firm enough with China. And I think my response to you on that would be that I think the East-West Center's role is to engage all of our partners, all of our potential partners, and even our adversaries in a process that hopefully will kind of be the carrot side of it as opposed to the stick side of it. And so I don't think the East-West Center really has the responsibility of sitting there and telling China to go take a hike. I think the East-West Center has the responsibility of, and other agencies as well. And I'll give you one more example very quickly. We in Honolulu, in Hawaii, because of our geographic role and our cultural role, we belong to the Asia-Pacific region. If I fly from here to Honolulu, I am more than halfway to Asia. So that'll give you some sense of where we think we are in terms of the world. So we think a lot about the Indo-Pacific, and so does the Indo-Pacific. They think that Honolulu and Hawaii is kind of a safe place to have these discussions. So we have not only Indo-Pacom, which engages China, right there at Indo-Pacom. We have the East-West Center, which engages China. We also have the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies, which is a DoD affiliate, which engages China. And I think they all have that role. So I think the East-West Center has a really critical role to play in terms of trying to always, with a strong military defense posture, encourage China to remain engaged, to play by the rules, to play by the international trade rules. And that's what their role is, and even the professional rules. You have leaders of China right now that attended the East-West Center. I think that's a good thing, that they have some familiarity, that they've met with people from Bali that have also been to the East-West Center.
Thank you.
If I may, my friend, I understand Ms. Wagner has to leave shortly. Could you wait a few moments for your
Sure.
questions?
I-
And we'll take Ms. Wagner, and then I'll give the rest of our members an opportunity to direct those questions, both
Thank you.
to
Thank you,
Mr.
Madam
Case
Chairwoman.
and Ms. Wagner.
And thank you so much for your courtesy. I am, in fact, serving both on Foreign Affairs and on Financial Services, and I'm in the middle of a markup of which I had a couple amendments, so I'm eager to get back. Chairwoman Lowy, Ranking
you.
Member Rogers, other members, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. As a former U.S. Ambassador and the Vice-Ranking Member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I cannot overstate America's centrality in safeguarding human rights, fostering peace, and promoting economic development, trade, and good governance worldwide. I've had the opportunity to travel with Ms. Torres on these very missions across Central America and our world. With countries like China and Russia working to undermine democratic values and respect for human rights, American leadership is more important than ever. And the U.S.-led international order has helped populations across the globe enjoy safer, more stable, and frankly more prosperous lives. And I believe American diplomatic engagement is critical to leaving a better world for the next generation. Peace and stability are a prerequisite for prosperity. But as we see in Syria, Burma, and elsewhere, many states are engaged in large-scale violence against their own citizens. And the United States has a responsibility to help these vulnerable communities. For that reason, I want to voice my strong support for robust funding for the Complex Crisis Fund, or CCF. The CCF is a critical global account that enables the United States to respond swiftly and efficiently to unforeseen crises, filling a gap when other monies are unavailable. Foreign service officers and USAID workers in the field rely on the CCF to mitigate incipient humanitarian crises and prevent conflicts from spinning out of control. And data analysis from the Institute of Economics and Peace indicates that strong funding for the CCF could actually save taxpayers' money in the long run. They would submit that for every dollar invested now, the cost of conflict would be reduced by $16. I urge you to fund this account at least $10 million in fiscal year 2020. Also, one of the top priorities in Congress in ending human trafficking, an injustice that has enslaved over 40 million people worldwide, I can say that the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons has been instrumental in building partner nation capacity and incentivizing effective anti-trafficking measures. I urge you to provide robust funding to the TIP office so it can improve justice systems and prosecutions of traffickers and sex buyers in partner nations. Frankly, doing my own TIP report as a former U.S. ambassador was so very important and impactful in what I was able then to bring to Congress and promote legislatively from a policy standpoint. And finally, I ask you to allocate robust funding for democracy programs in Burma. In fiscal year 2019, the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, received $4 million for its activities in Burma. It has used these funds to promote the development of civil society and strengthen democratic institutions. NED is helping to build a Burma in which genocide, brutalities, and rights violations against the country's minorities are unthinkable. And I urge you to continue supporting its mission at least that $4 million level. I ask you to ensure that our assistance to Burma does not in any way make the United States complicit in the appalling crimes that Burmese military they have committed against the Rohingya, the Shan, the Kachin, and other ethnic groups. Last year, the House version of the NDAA included language limiting security assistance and military cooperation until the Department of State certifies that the Burmese government has held perpetrators accountable for human rights abuses. I was deeply disappointed that the final NDAA did not include this language, and I hope that the SFOP's appropriations bill for fiscal year 20 reflects its provisions regardless. Members of the Burmese military responsible for committing genocide and other crimes against humanity must be held responsible for their actions. The Burmese military should not receive 1 cent of U.S. foreign military financing until it takes action to end and atone for egregious human rights abuses. America excels at helping our partners build capacity, good governance practices, and democratic institutions. Democratizing and developing countries want and need us to remain a reliable partner. I hope the subcommittee will support strong funding for, again, the U.S. anti-trafficking, for conflict prevention, and for capacity building programming. So I thank you for all your hard work on these issues. I appreciate your courtesy. Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member, I'm happy to take any questions or dash.
Give us your choice. Would you like to take questions, or do you want to dash?
Do I
And then I'll
have-
bring Mr. Case
Yeah.
back.
Where are we? Are they voting yet? Okay, I probably have to leave in just a few minutes. If you have any questions, I'm happy to entertain a couple, but
I just
do wanna
want
make-
to, before I turn it over, well, maybe I'll give our members who didn't ask some questions. I'll do it that way. I just want to thank you for your testimony, and I must say that I was part of several celebratory events with Aung San Suu Kyi, and this was probably one of the most disappointing results I can ever imagine in the time that I was here. And I thank you for your activism. Wish you had some advice.
Yeah.
I don't know if you do.
It's very tough.
Otherwise, I'll turn to another question before you leave.
I agree. I can tell you, in terms of some of the priorities that I've laid out here, I think that Chairman Engel is very committed to the CCF and actually getting behind it. I have fought for this on the Republican side of the aisle for some time. He is committed to this also, and I think that anything we can do from a prevention side early on is very, very important. I think that will make a big difference in arming our foreign service officers and others to work more on the preventative side. I've had the pleasure of passing the Genocide and Atrocities Act, which CCF was very much a part of, and but I think we're going to put some more teeth to it in this next Congress. Any other questions?
Why don't I turn to Ms. Torres, because you were next.
Thank you for your leadership in these issues, specifically with sex trafficking.
Yeah.
You know, we were in Iquitos, Peru, and we visited a center that was built to help support infants that are sex trafficked. I didn't know that type of tourism existed.
It was just
And
horrific.
It was horrible to find out that it's American citizens traveling
Exploiting.
there for the purpose of exploiting infants. So thank you for that work. And I just want to encourage you. I know that this is a very, very difficult issue for you, but women need support. And when rape is, you know, a favorite weapon of war, we have to find a way to help provide health care for the women that have been raped and
Yes.
result in unwanted pregnancies and are left on the side of the road, you know, to care for themselves and an unwanted child that no one recognizes as a human being. It's shameful. It's a black eye, but I hope that we can find a space where we can work to
I hope so, too. And I look-
fortify the health care of these women.
I look forward to that, and I can tell you that my gender side bill also is very much a part of that too. There are so many little girls across this country, sadly, that are killed
Yes.
in the womb because of their gender, because they are little girls, and it goes along the same line. So we'll be putting that legislation, I hope, forward again, and it's been generally on a bipartisan basis. So I look forward to working with you on those issues.
Mr. Fortenberry or Ms. Roby, do you have any questions before we go back to Mr. Case? Do you want to go now? Okay, sir.
Absolutely.
With great respect.
Yes.
Thank you for being here to
Always.
give us your perspective on this ongoing tragedy in Burma.
Yeah, it's awful.
But in the 019 bill that we just passed, we've got $86.4 million in economic support funds to support civil society, advance the national reconciliation process, and improve the lives left vulnerable by decades of military rule. It also has $3.5 billion for the international narcotics control funding. No monies for international security assistance, none. And State Department interaction with the Burmese military is limited to human rights and disaster response. So we hear you. It's an ongoing tragedy that we'll deal with. Thank you.
Well, and I appreciate that, and I just, again, can't say enough about the National Endowment for Democracy, and that $4 million that NED need, that grant money that they need to have, I think, more programming control over, and I think can also go a long way to helping to build a Burma in which these kinds of brutalities and genocide and human rights violations are unthinkable. So I thank you, Ranking Member. Thank you all so very, very much. I am going to put my roller skates on and dash back to Rayburn.
Mr.
you. I
Case,
appreciate your courtesy.
thank you very much. And Mr. Case, you have been so very patient.
Thank you, Mr. Case. Thank you.
Why don't we continue, Mr. Fortenberry?
Thank you, Congressman. We don't
know each other real well. Would you mind if I speak presumptuously about your presentation based upon what will hopefully be a friendship, because it's meant to be constructive, what I have to say. When I left Nebraska, it was -4. If you really want to have an impact, I think a field hearing at the East-West Center in Hawaii would have been preferable to this presentation.
I think that's I want to speak, I think that's an excellent idea. I think that there is a great need for people from Nebraska to understand the Indo-Pacific region.
Okay, we found common cause and common ground. Just on a serious note, following up on what Ranking Member Rogers, our former chairman, said, I think this issue of China looms so large in terms of really the 21st century architecture of diplomatic relations. And both the USAID director, as I recall, but recently I was with, frankly, the Secretary of State yesterday and 2 days ago in Iowa, spoke of China's predatory lending practice. And the more that we can socialize this concept, I think the world actually is awakened to this harsh reality of coming in and holding hostage, in effect, developing countries to their larger ideological agenda. I get what you're saying, and I respect what you're saying in terms of the East-West Center being a bridge for diplomatic dialogue and not necessarily the hammer side of the carrot, but of the incentives. But I do think socializing this harsh reality of what China has done in really improperly disrupting what ought to be fundamental attacks by all of us on structural poverty around the world to lead to stability and good diplomatic outcomes. I throw that to you to connect.
No, I think it's along the same lines as your question, Ranking Member. It's a very good debate. How do we deal with China in the big picture over the next generations, long after we're not here anymore? I think that if you listen to the debate, let's define the debate by its extremes. One side of the debate says, let's only deal with this militarily and let's isolate China. And let's basically dry up any contact with China in all other spheres. Okay, so that's kind of one extreme. The other extreme is we don't really have to worry about China, and if we, appease China and placate them and let them do what they want to do, then that's the way to go.
Or the free market, in its working itself out, will ultimately create the types of interconnectedness that we will develop human rights and respect for.
Well, and that's
I think that's in the extreme too.
Yes, and one could argue that's part of the policy we've followed for the last 20 years, that we hoped that would happen. Now, obviously, it didn't. So let's be frank about that. I think we're on the same page, aren't we? So then the question is, what do we do? And I'm saying that we need to pursue this on a number of levels. It's a very nuanced set of levels. I'm agreeing with you, first of all, on your premise. Okay, so I'm not one of those people that is naive about China. I think China has every aspiration to be the dominant world power and to not participate in a world order if it can get away with that, if it serves its own purposes, and it's busy trying to do that. We need a strong military in the Indo-Pacific, so let's do that given. Now let's talk about the rest of it. How do we actually try to get China to modify its behavior? And I think engagement is the right way to do that. Sometimes you can't see it happening until it actually happens. For example, I've been in meetings at the East-West Center, or for that matter, other places in Hawaii, and I've heard from members that have participated in meetings of the same thing, where you have people from China who come into those meetings. Now they're safe zones for talking. They're not in China. They're told in no uncertain terms how the rest of the world is feeling about them. I think that's valuable that they take that back to China. And you never know when it's going to actually result in a change in behavior. But what I think can happen, if we're not careful, if we isolate China and really shut it off from that avenue of discourse, whether that avenue of discourse is at the East-West Center or the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies, or any number of other possible areas to have that, then you're going to end up in a situation like North Korea, where you have nobody that really knows what's happening, and they don't know enough about the rest of the world to bring it back to North Korea to say, hey, this is really what the view is out there. So I think that that's what's so valuable about this particular track. And yeah, those discussions should include, you guys are not playing by the rules. You're predatory lending. You're stealing intellectual property. You are dominating and losing your own partners. That's the struggle that we have. It's a big picture struggle, and we've got to fight that struggle on a multiple levels. So this is, I'm talking way beyond the East-West Center, but it fits into that pattern.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone have any additional questions? My right has left. Well, let me thank you for coming. I do look forward to a hearing in your magnificent, whether it's East-West Center or another meeting. The weather is sure better than here in Nebraska, and I really appreciate your input.
Thank you very much.
here today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so this concludes today's hearing. The Subcommittee on State Foreign Operations and Relations. Did you want to say anything? No, ma'am, I'm sorry. Oh, the Subcommittee on State Foreign Operations and Related Programs stands adjourned.